Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of our Around the Bureau series here at the Commerce Research Library. I'm Laura, one of the librarians. We are delighted to have Dr. Ajit Jillavenkatesa. How'd I do?
Very well.
Okay, great. Here to talk about nanotechnology standardization today. Before we begin, to those in the audience in the library, please use common sense cell phone courtesy and adjust your ringers. And for those of you joining us via WebEx today, we actually have a very large virtual crowd. Feel free to use the chat function at any time to ask questions, and I will use the mic and address them as they come up. I'd also like to make a plea for audience feedback, so please either answer the survey on your chair or the pop-up survey that comes when you exit the WebEx. To learn more about our upcoming events, you can go to library.doc.gov and view our calendar. A few things we have coming up are Dr. Catherine Sullivan, who's the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and NOAA Administration. She'll be here February 24th as part of the Enterprising Women of Commerce series. This one will not be offered remotely or recorded, so please try and come see it in person if you can. Dr. Peter Vallone, also of NIST, will be speaking about human identity testing using DNA on March 12th. And we're also co-hosting a film screening, so something new, and a panel discussion with the Commercial Law Development Program on March 3rd. The film Afghan Dreams is a documentary following a team of 4 young law students. The team was sponsored by CLDP as they competed in the World Cup of Legal Arbitration. The filmmaker, along with CLDP's Steve Gardner, will be on hand to discuss the film, the competition, and the tremendous cultural odds that these 4 young women faced. And now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jillavenkatesa is a Senior Standards Policy Advisor with the Standards Coordination Office at NIST. He specializes in standards and conformity assessment related policy issues in South Asia, Asia Pacific, and the Mid-East Asia regions, and in emerging technologies such as nanotechnology and information and communication technologies. Ajit provides policy and technical expertise to NIST staff and leadership, DOC, other government agencies, and the private sector. He contributes documentary standards and conformity assessment expertise to intra- and intergovernmental groups, bridging the worlds of standards, technology, international trade, and regulatory policy. So welcome.
Great, Laura, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for joining this conversation today. I usually like to keep my presentations very interactive, so please feel free to raise your hands, ask questions, and certainly please feel free to interrupt. You know, this is really a lighthearted look. Nanotechnology can certainly become very technical, and rather than talk about the technology, the technical issues, what I really wanted to do was to give you a sense for just the very exciting stuff that's happening around standardization, around emerging technologies like nanotechnology. And using that as a medium or as a vehicle, perhaps start talking a little bit about what we're seeing as changing dynamics in the worlds of standardization. So where this really starts to touch upon us is as commerce employees. You know, it doesn't matter which bureau we're with. When we're working with industry, these are things which are impacting industry on a day-to-day basis. These are things that our customers out in the private sector are either looking at and wondering, what does this really mean? How is this going to impact us? Or in many instances, they're coming to us and asking for assistance. So the idea here is to perhaps just kind of give you a sense for the fun world that I happen to have had the opportunity to play in and work in. So we'll start out with just a very broad discussion about what is nanotechnology. Again, I promise there are no equations, there are no physical symbols in my talk. I think that's a different talk. I'll talk a little bit about standardization and then kind of pull the 2 things together, nanotechnology and standardization. Using that as an example, I'll touch upon a little bit upon the types of issues that we are seeing and why should we care about those things? Just some thought-provoking considerations. We've certainly been hearing a lot about nanotechnology, and the enthusiasm around nanotechnology and the investments around nanotechnology really beg the question, is nanotechnology new? And much as we might be tempted to think about nanotechnology as an emerging technology, which is exactly the way we call it, it's exactly the way we categorize it, it's actually been around for a very, very long time. The slides that you see are an example of Roman applications of nanotechnology. The Lycurgus cup is a 4th century Roman cage cup. What was really unique about it was, depending upon how you lighted the cup would actually have different illuminations. So if you illuminated the cup from the front, you'd see the image on the left. But if you illuminated the cup from behind the cup, you'd see this very reddish, beautiful, rich tinge in the cup. And this is a great example of an application of nanotechnology. What we know is the reason we're seeing that really beautiful color is there are actually gold and silver nanoparticles which were mixed in with the precursor material that made that glass. And because they're in that right size range, when the light falls on it, it creates that very beautiful effect. So this is just one example. We're talking about the 4th century AD. Switch forward a few hundred years. You're now into the medieval ages. Damascene steel, a very strong steel. It was called Damascene steel because the Persians were the ones who actually perfected this into a regular steel usage, mostly for their weapons. What we know today is the reason the steel was very unique, very strong, other than the fact that it's also made these beautiful patterns, was it actually had what we call today carbon nanotubes and nanowires. This is a lost art form. There have been many efforts to try to revive this, to kind of go back and see how could you possibly have made Damascene steel. And there are lots of theories and discussions about, does this actually work, doesn't it work, so on and so forth. But the bottom line really was, we know from the metallographic analysis that they were exactly the kinds of things that we call nano objects today that were being used in this steel. So clearly, it's been around for a while. People knew about this. We'll get back to, in a few minutes, about what's really driving the interest today. But let me kind of start with a definition of nanotechnology, and I'll use the definition that the National Nanotechnology Initiative uses. The National Nanotechnology Initiative was started in 2000, and kind of it provided a framework within which the federal government's priorities and activities for nanotechnology could be framed. It also created a basis by which funding for agencies could be decided upon. But there are really 3 aspects to nanotechnology. And the 3 aspects are highlighted in blue. It's the understanding and control of matter. So it's not just stuff which happens, but it's your ability to actively control. It's a size range, approximately 1 to 100 nanometers. And lastly, it's the unique phenomena. Unique phenomenon means you would otherwise not see these outside of this size range. So it's when you put all these 3 things together, we really define nanotechnology as we understand today. So what exactly do we mean by 1 to 100 nanometers? Just to kind of give you a sense for the size scale that we're looking at. The bar across is the nanometer size scale. A glucose molecule is approximately a nanometer. An antibody is about 10 nanometers. And a virus is about 100 nanometers. What does that mean in a real basis? Well, a tennis ball would be about 1/10 of a billion nanometers. What does that really mean? Thickness of hair, of human hair, average human hair, is about 100,000 nanometers. So now you kind of start to get a sense for that. Thickness of a typical sheet of paper is about 100,000 nanometers. So we're really, really in the small size scale. The second aspect that we had was understanding and control of matter. Understanding and control of matter means not only being able to figure out how to move these molecules, how to move these atoms around, but also in a positive way, figuring out how do you actually build up structures. Where this is having a huge effect is in the image that you see on the right, our ability to form complex electronic structures which actually have a very specific function. The latest generation of smartphones actually have a lot of nanotechnology in them, whether it's in the form of chips, whether it's in the form of screens, which have enhanced responsiveness to touch. All of them are manifestations of nanotechnology, and our ability to pinpoint where we put down features and how we join those features really gets to the issue of understanding and control of matter. The third issue that we had was unique phenomena. So what really causes or what drives these unique phenomena? As you go smaller in size, the surface area starts to have a much larger effect than the actual bulk. So what does that mean? If you look at the image right now, I have a block in there. Each side of the block is about 1 centimeter. So the total surface area is going to be 6 square centimeters, because each surface is 1 centimeter square and you have 6 surfaces. Now take that same block and for each dimension divide that into 10 smaller blocks. So now each of those blocks comprising the large block is about 1 millimeter. What you've now done is created a much larger surface area, about 10 times, 60 square centimeters. You then go even further smaller. So you're now at about a nanometer cube. By the time you add up that surface area, which comprises the surface of all those blocks, you're looking at 60 million square centimeters. So what you're seeing is an exponential increase where the surface area effects are much larger. They simply predominate or take over the effects that you'd otherwise see from the bulk. And this is really what starts to create much of the unique phenomena that we see. The US government's interest in nanotechnology was really framed by the start of the National Nanotechnology Initiative. President Clinton in 2000, put out this statement, but this was really capturing facts which people had already been working on, facts that people knew were already there. Richard Feynman, in a talk at Caltech in 1959, kind of really brought this issue forward, where he talked about, in a talk which he called "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom," he kind of put out this challenge for people, both in a speculative manner and also in a intellectual curiosity manner, to say, let's really look at what can we do in this size range. What can we really do when we start to move atoms and molecules, when we actually start putting things together? So the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which now actually comprises of about 27 different federal agencies, of which 20 agencies have a very active role. This is both departments and independent agencies, come together in mostly a collaborative manner to identify areas of priorities that they believe are worth exploring and that should be areas of research, areas of commercialization. These agencies, in a sense, represent the federal government's investment in nanotechnology. So, since having started in 2010, formally as the National Nanotechnology Initiative, it's now been around for about 15 years, and we're starting to see a lot of applications of nanotechnology coming online. And these applications range from very industrial applications to consumer applications. Just for some examples, those of you who follow technology news, and particularly the Consumer Electronics Show this year, would have heard about quantum dot televisions. LG Electronics, their big coming out at the CES 2015, was talking about quantum dot televisions. Quantum dots are basically nanoparticles, which in a very particular size range have very bright luminosity. They show colors very well. So if you were to take a television screen, incorporate quantum dots into those, and you know exactly how to turn them on and turn them off, you get images which are much more brighter, much more vivid. The contrasts are much greater than the screen that you see on the right, which doesn't have these quantum dots. The other thing where we see an application of nanotechnology on almost a very regular basis are the new sunscreen products that are coming online. Many of them have nanoparticles in them. They give us enhanced protection, nano polish, nano coatings. We're starting to see more and more of these applications coming online. You know, we're seeing these applications in sporting equipment, golf clubs, tennis rackets, bicycle frames which are stronger but yet they're lighter. And all this is being made possible by nanotechnology. To kind of give you a sense for the types of markets, the types of dollar amounts that we're talking about, Lux Research, which does a lot of business intelligence and analysis, puts out the State of the Market report. And early last year, they did an update on their projections of the market. And to kind of give you a sense for what we're looking at is in 2012, the global investments in nanotechnology were on the order of about $18.5 billion. Of this, just the US contribution was about 36%, the highest from any one country. If you break that down further and see what's the government's contribution versus what's the private sector's contribution, approximately 2.1 billion was from governments, whether it's the federal government, whether it's the state government, and the private sector investment was about $4 billion. The private sector investment, when you look across private sector around the world, is still the United States is the leading country. The second behind the United States is Japan. The other interesting thing, of course, is even though we have this advantage in terms of investment, one of the things that we're seeing is other countries are slowly closing that gap, both in terms of government investments and in terms of private sector investments. The other interesting element to watch over here is the growth in revenue from nano-enabled products, products which incorporate nanotechnology. From 2010, when the investments were just below $340 billion, to 2012, a period of 2 years, it's more than doubled. Pretty impressive. But when you look at the global value of the nanotechnology value chain, in another 3 years, that number is estimated to be $4.4 trillion. There's a lot of discussion about, you know, how solid are these numbers? Should we really believe these? But I think there are a couple of things. One is, it's not just products, it's the value chain. The value chain is that entire, right from raw material to processing to product to the endpoint. So yes, the numbers are certainly on the high side, but it kind of starts to give you a sense for two things. One, the fact that the investments are actually there. And the second, that these products, the commercialization is happening and it's happening very fast. It also kind of starts to give you a sense for what's driving the excitement behind nanotechnology. So nanotechnology and the promise of nanotechnology really lies in the fact that it's a cross-cutting technology. It's not applicable to one area, it's not just physics, it's not just chemistry, it's not just biology. It really builds upon everything, and that means the applications are also very broad. There are societal applications. People are thinking about using nanotechnology for purifying water. There are some very, very fascinating solutions that are coming up where you can actually go into developing countries which don't have adequate water supplies, where potable water supplies are really hard to come with. But just using a nanotechnology-based filter, you can take groundwater and filter it within a few minutes. Similarly, for waste remediation, nanotechnology is kind of offering a lot of promise. When you look at energy and energy sources, lighter batteries, more efficient solar panels, which means for the amount of light that's falling on a solar panel, you can actually get more energy out of it. Structural materials, particularly in the transportation industry, stronger and lighter materials, cheaper. So these are all things which actually have a cumulative effect.
Can I interrupt for a question?
Sure, please.
Where is the greatest need or room for growth in the nanotech value chain? What are the limiting resources for nanotechnology growth, like training, equipment, raw materials, et cetera?
So I'll start out with this. Let me just finish up the slide and I'll come back to that question. The other areas certainly are in the medical area, advanced therapeutics, targeted drug delivery, so personalized medicine. Being able to take nanotechnology and say, you know, I need to deliver a particular cancer-fighting agent to a very particular spot, so I don't have the other effects of, for example, things like chemotherapy. So there's a lot of promise, and certainly in the consumer area. Going back to the question that Laura had just fielded, I think what we see as the big limiting factor right now is really the next slide, the unanswered question. So for all the promise about nanotechnology, there are still very, very significant questions that people are dealing with about, is it safe? If nanotechnology is being used for either consumer products or industrial products, and I'm coming in touch with these, I could be inhaling some of these nanoparticles, I could be ingesting them, I could be touching them. Are they safe? They're so small, they'll get through most biological materials. What happens when they go inside? People have been looking at a lot of these studies to say, how safe are these? Under what conditions are they safe? Under what conditions can they create an adverse reaction? And while we're starting to develop a body of knowledge, we do not have any definitive answers. There's also a lot of debate and discussion about when you're structuring these studies, how do you actually set up these studies? So I'll just give you an example. If you're trying to do a study where you say an organism is exposed to nano objects, what's the best way to figure out an adequate dosing? In some studies, the dosing is on a very slow but steady period, which is you dose it over a period of time at a relatively small dose. There are other studies where they said, you know, let's just take the entire cumulative dose and expose the organism to it in one go. And the answers are very different. And then the debate starts about, well, listen, if you just take the cumulative dose, give it in one go, you're choking your organism. Naturally, it'll die. But people say, but you know, you want to see that effect very fast. So there's certainly a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. The other aspect, which really ties into this unanswered question, is when there are these questions about safety, people have an expectation about, should this be regulated? Should this not be regulated? What aspects should be regulated? The regulatory agencies are really caught in a very tight spot. They have to regulate based on science. We're still trying to figure out the science for many of these answers. We don't have those answers. We don't have definitive answers. We're starting to get some of those answers, and that's kind of part of what you see also, but certainly in the United States. The regulatory agencies are trying to walk this very fine balance between ensuring safety, ensuring protection, but not being too onerous, such that we end up killing the technology or such that we end up harming the technology. And sometimes, articles in the media, overreaction gets out a little bit ahead of us. You'll see a couple of examples right over here. Look at the image on the left. Is nanotechnology the new GMO? To the right of that is a product called Magic Nano. It was sold in the European Union, particularly in Germany. Most people wouldn't have even thought anything about it. But what really brought this onto the global stage was people who purchased Magic Nano. It's a bathroom cleaner to clean tiles in the bathroom. There were about 60 to 80 reports where people said that after using that spray, they had breathing difficulties. So immediately, people are going to say, did it have anything to do with nano? So the product was banned from the market. There was a lot of studies that went on. What it came down to was actually there was nothing nano in it at all whatsoever. It was just a regular cleaner. There was some differences with the droplet sizes, but certainly not nano. And it really then begs the question, if it didn't have nano in its name, would it have created the same reaction where you had world media following this and saying, is this safe, is this not safe? Sometimes you see the other reaction, the very adverse reaction, where you start hearing about calls for something to say, we need a label which has nano in it, that there is a hazard that's associated with it. Of course, our approach in the United States is, do we have the science to make such a call? Where do we get those answers? So there are some very significant questions and answers that we're really struggling with at this point of time. And the nice thing about this is a lot of the effort that's going on is a very systematic, very studied approach. Part of the challenge is the expectations for answers don't quite match the time frame in which the commercialization is taking place and people are actually using these products. So a little bit of a riff on the size of the particles and a lot of the unknown. And nanotechnology has really hit mainstream when it actually starts to make the comics and the funny pages. I want to switch gears a little bit and then get on to the other aspect, which is standards and standardization. Just for establishing a baseline, standards have different meanings. They mean different things to different people. So as just an example over here, at NIST, and certainly in commerce, standards could mean a physical standard, something like what you see in the image to the left. It's something that you'd actually go purchase from NIST, purchase from a scientific house, purchase from laboratories which are very similar to NIST but in other countries. It has a very well-studied and a very well-characterized material. So when you take that material, run it in your instrument, you know what answer to expect. There can also be something like what you see towards the right, which is a documentary standard. Documentary standards that you might be very familiar with might be something like ISO 9000 or ISO 14000. These are the kinds of things that we hear on a daily basis. For the purposes of this discussion, what I'll really do is focus on documentary standards. And yes, standards do matter. Standards are great. Usually, they're working when everything else is working, when things are going smoothly. When something doesn't work, typically our first reaction is there should be a standard for that. Right? A really good example is you travel to a foreign country, you're trying to plug into an electrical outlet, and clearly it's a different pin configuration, and our reaction is, if only they'd standardize these outlets. So they're there everywhere, and the bottom line is they matter. They matter because in this increasingly global and connected world, standards do a lot of fundamental things. They provide us a common language for communication. Vocabulary standards will actually define terms. They'll define protocols. They'll say, how do you measure? When do you measure? What do you measure? When standards are used in regulation, they create a reliable method on which we can ensure certain levels of health, safety, environmental protection. And standards really do reflect the state of technology. When standards, as in the United States, are driven by the private sector, you have very active industry participation. It's in their interest to actually have standards which reflect the state of technology. Because these are collaborative activities, what they also do is they create a certain foundation, a certain common baseline for technological innovation. And a really, really good example of this one is pick up literally any electronic device. Smartphones, not the iPhone for this particular example, your camera, your laptop, most electrical devices. When you have to charge or when you want to transfer information, what do? You connect into the USB port. There is a fantastic example of a standard that has become so prevalent that now when you go to purchase, for example, a camera, you don't even think about how will I get my data off the camera. You don't even think about, how will I charge this? You just take it for granted. It then starts to give manufacturers the flexibility to go build on stuff. And it enables economies of scale. It's the same method, it's the same process, use it in many different countries. You can actually take away a lot of the uncertainties that you'd otherwise have. So standards really cut broadly and cut across trade, technology, innovation, and competition. And this also kind of starts to give you a sense for certainly commerce's interest in standards and in standardization. Every bureau, as you look across that, has a stake in how these things turn out. In emerging technologies, standardization can kind of play a really, really unique role, because in emerging technologies, what you're seeing is everyone kind of trying to gain a little bit of a competitive advantage. So there is both a competitive aspect, there's a collaborative aspect. The competitive aspect thrives very well when the collaborative aspect works. What the collaborative aspects do is, by working in standards, you can create the tools which enable technology development. You can actually kind of create the interface points. How do these different technologies touch each other? The foundational technologies really create the basis. And a really good example of this, for instance, is when you look at smart grid efforts that are currently underway, or cybersecurity that we're involved in as the Department of Commerce, or big data. A lot of the standardization is creating those foundational platforms, the foundational frameworks on which these technologies are then further built on. Very specifically, when you look at nanotechnology standardization, this activity started in around 2004, around 2005. And standardization activity is really happening in a range of different bodies. You have organizations which are country-based representation, organizations like ISO. You have creators of international standards in bodies like ASTM, which are actually individual-based organizations. National standards bodies, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, are very, very active in nanotechnology standardization. They're all following slightly different paths. All of them have different memberships, and the membership really drives their trajectories. But really, there are certain common elements in most of these activities. There is very strong industry participation. It keeps the standardization activities very relevant, very meaningful, and grounded in reality. And these standards are playing a very important role in also enabling trade, in enabling the growth of technology. So when you think about it, you could make a raw material in one country, but the products might very well be made in another country. In order to move it from one country to another, from one company to another, how do you define your product specifications? Standards enable you to do that. The standardization activities are also addressing a lot of the fundamental questions which go to the question of, is it safe? Can I use them? Can I not use them? And certainly there is extensive global participation. In nanotechnology standardization, there are some key drivers. One is the growth of consumer products, the growth of industrial products, the growth of medical products, which incorporate nanotechnology in various forms. The other is just the trade. And the third is the innovation aspect. With these really broad drivers, what you're really seeing are just a broad range of questions that are getting addressed. Questions from very fundamental issues like, is this material safe? Or when is this material safe? Or when will this material be something where I need to be aware of? To how can I improve consumer confidence by using a particular standard? As regulators are looking to to develop regulations, they are looking to use standards. Yes, ma'am.
You have a few questions that tie into this. Can I interrupt you for them?
Please.
All right. The first one is a little bit of a lengthy one. As a graduate student, this performed extensive work on the growth of carbon nanotubes and implementation into new material coatings and devices. Early in the work, I was not aware that I was inhaling a significant amount of these nanomaterials. Since nanomaterials exhibit properties that often differ from their respective bulk properties, what efforts are taking place to understand the role of these materials in the body and in the environment? Also, are these efforts commensurate in scope and keeping pace with this quickly expanding market and the sheer increase of nanomaterial production?
Absolutely, thank you, Laura. So there are really two questions that are involved in here. One is the question about how do you ensure adequate controls to make sure that someone like the person who posed this question isn't actually inhaling something that could be potentially dangerous. So one is, do we actually have a body of knowledge that gets to that issue? And later in the slide, I'll actually point out to that yes, there are actually guidelines, there are publications which talk about how do you ensure adequate worker safety, how do you ensure adequate worker protection. One of the things I can certainly do is follow up with the person who posed this question and point them to very specific documents that have been developed, for instance, by NIOSH and by ISO, which actually talks about what are good practices for ensuring that people are not inhaling carbon nanotubes. The second question, and perhaps this is the more important question, is when these documents are actually there and they are available, how do you increase awareness about the availability of these good practices? That is a very, very difficult question, and that's a tough question that we're really grappling with. We face this question on an almost daily basis in the standards world. The standards community does a great job in putting out these standards, but then the challenge is, how do you make people aware of the fact that these standards are there?
And that was the next question
Okay.
that someone asked, which is
Sure.
how would you suggest a layperson better understand what are concrete limitations to know what we're actually talking about with products that involve nanotechnology? She referenced the NanoMagic cleaning product you had talked about before.
You know, and this is again one of those questions that can often be a challenging question. I think for someone who is a U.S. government employee, and that's a very small fraction of the world. We have a lot of resources right within the US government where someone can go and say, hey, can you help me out? We actually have something called the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office, the NNCO, and it's very easy, www.nano.gov. So they run a tremendous amount of, they have access to a lot of resources, they have a great website that people can actually go look up, and certainly they answer a lot of these questions about safety, about latest trends, new trends, what is happening in the nano world. Going back to the other question about, or the other aspect of this question about raising awareness, or often taking these very technical documents and trying to simplify them into layperson terms, into plain English. There is increasing awareness amongst groups which are developing these documents that we need to do a better job in demystifying, say, standards. I'll give you an example. ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, we've developed a lot of standards relating to nanotechnology. Now, one of the things that we're actually working on is plain language guides for this. What do these actually mean? There are also a lot of resources, consumer resources, nonprofits, who actually try to take some of this information, demystify it, make it available in easy to understand terms, easy to understand language. So certainly there are resources. I would say nano.gov is a great place to start with if someone is in the United States. Any other questions?
A few technical ones that maybe you're on. Do you want to go for them?
We'll get to the end. Right. So looking at nanotechnology standardization, things are happening in different places, but there are almost 4 broad areas in which these activities are happening. One is terminology, simply what do you call it? Second is measurement. How would you measure something? The EHS aspects, is it safe? And then the fourth is the material specification, which is, and this is really the trade focus, what needs to be measured? How do I measure it? So what you'll start to see is literally a connection between all 4 aspects or all 4 elements. To kind of give you a sense for how standards are developed, and certainly I'm going to use the example of nanotechnology. I'm using two different standards organizations, ASTM, which is actually headquartered here in just outside of Philadelphia, ISO, which is headquartered outside of Geneva. Different models, but really getting to the same thing. When you look at their nanotechnology activities, ASTM has almost about 170 participants from 20 countries. ISO, which is a country-based participation model, actually has about 34 participating countries, 14 observer countries. But what they all have in common are very similar processes which have principles of openness, transparency, due process, balance of interest. What this does is it ensures that the standards which result, and here are some examples, actually represent not just one group's interests, but rather the interests of a broad group of people. So some examples of the types of standards are vocabulary standards. What do you call something? What do you define it as? Standards can also be about measurements. How do you measure the size of a particle? We said, nanoparticles are 1 to 100 nanometers. But how do you actually measure them? Here we go, going back to the question about how do I was exposed to nanomaterials, nano-objects in the laboratory. So this is the NIOSH document that has been formalized into a standard, occupational risk management applied to engineered nanomaterials. What do you have to do to make sure that you have the right engineering controls in place? Another example from IEC, which talks about material specifications in the context of electronic applications. While all this activity is happening, geared towards use of nanomaterials, there's also a strong interest in actually making sure that we have a workforce that's aware and that's educated. So when you look at the second from the bottom, new practice for standard practice it's a new proposal. It's in the process of being developed for workforce education in nanotechnology characterization. The last one really forms the basis for the conversation, which is the last part of this discussion about guidance on voluntary labeling for consumer products containing manufactured nano-objects. It's a fascinating case study, and there could be an entire talk that's just based on that aspect. What this really captures is this growing trend of which way is standardization going. So certainly while in nanotechnology, a lot of these technical issues, the technical standardization aspects continue to be addressed. If you think back to the discussion that we had about how nanotechnology is finding its way into a lot of consumer products, people are also asking about how do I participate? How do I contribute to the development of these standards because they're going to impact me? So what we're starting to see is a greater interest in consumer and societal considerations. The challenge that we have is when you start bringing these issues in, many of them come very, very close to policy considerations. And people actually have a fairly strong reaction because policy aspects, policy implications, policy considerations are often mostly governmental prerogatives. There's this very difficult tension between a private sector organization, which may have representatives from many governments, developing products that have policy implications, which then start to bear on an inherently governmental function. So with the increasing participation of non-technical experts, we're seeing some very strong challenges. How do you develop a common understanding of what the standards development process is supposed to do? If I'm a traditional technology person, I've come to ISO, I want to develop a technical standard. I want to know how to measure something. My colleague, who is a societal expert or a consumer expert, might say, it doesn't matter. If whatever you're developing is not safe for the consumers, you should not be working on it. You should be trying to do something that's actually safe. Why are you putting consumer safety or the safety of citizens behind how you measure something very esoteric? Is it a fair question? It depends upon which side of the debate you actually sit on. But at the end of the day, what we're all trying to do is to get to the same shared end goal. And so when you have these two very diverse opinions, and each side has its own list of priorities, how do you then align those priorities? What's driving this, and this is certainly true not just for nanotechnology, but we're seeing this in other emerging technologies also. We're starting to hear about this in biotechnology, certainly being at play in information and communication technologies, is the fact that gone are the days when you could actually say, here's the technology, I'm just going to apply this to this very narrow technical areas. So if I'm doing cranes and elevators, all my standards apply just to cranes and elevators. We're now looking at technologies which are actually cutting across the board. Nanotechnology is finding its way into physics, into chemistry, into math, into material science, biotechnology. And these, because they're already finding their way into products, they are actually touching upon citizenry in a way many of these issues have not. And as we're starting to see more and more of these products become mainline products, kind of come into markets, people are asking, how's this really impacting me? Whether it's safety, whether it's questions of privacy, whether it's the next issue, which touches upon citizenry. I think there's some very valid questions. There's also a growing realization that standards are very, very powerful tools. Standards have taken on a profile nowadays that they previously didn't have, not even 10 years ago. A lot of it also has to do with a very large number of countries joining the World Trade Organization, being signatories to the technical barriers to trade. And that makes it a very powerful tool because countries are now bound by certain obligations. Increasingly, as countries realize that it's harder to work towards developing regulations, they look to standards as a proxy for regulations.
What is the outlook for hobbyists or entrepreneurs without funding looking to get into nanotech? Is it similar to what's beginning to happen with the 3D printing?
I think the outlook really is going to be determined by access to resources. I think from my perspective, there are no institutional barriers as such which would either prevent or limit hobbyists or backyard tinkerers, garage tinkerers from getting more involved in nanotechnology. The interesting thing also over here is when you look at startups in nanotechnology, a lot of them are really, really small startups. They actually focus on a very narrow idea. They have a very neat idea on something that they can do a little bit differently. And with the amount of venture capital funding that's kind of coming in, there's certainly a lot of funding that's available. The question is the tools that are needed. So when you look at, for example, 3D printing, the cost of 3D printers has gone down so dramatically, has gone down so significantly that people have very easy access to 3D printers. The question is, are we going to see the same trend in nanotechnology? I think certain instruments that you need, certain equipment, will stay expensive for a while, but what you actually are seeing differently is, for example, in places like a lot of outreach or extension centers that universities run. People have access to those instruments, so there's different models that are at play, but I think certainly I do see that nanotechnology and applications of nanotechnology will become more mainstream. Any other questions over there? We'll get back to the technical in a few. So this intersection of technology or technical and societal issues is really becoming a big challenge. I'm just going to present information that our colleague from the European Organization for Standardization had presented at a recent meeting. And when you look at some of the proposals that they are pondering or that they are considering, and you see proposals such as guidance for responsible development of nanotechnologies, discussions on work which talks about business-to-business labeling, or labeling of nanoparticles with stable isotopes to ensure traceability of nanoparticles. It really raises some serious questions about how much of this work is purely technical or technology-driven, and how much of this work is consumer-driven, which may have either just some touch points to the technical or the technology aspects. The juxtaposition over here is the fact that there are some very difficult questions to be addressed, to be answered, with what is the appropriate or the relevant body where this work should take place. So these softer issues, which don't necessarily involve technology immediately, are finding their way into technical and technological conversations. And this really raises some very difficult questions for us to think about and to consider. One of the things that's very clear is we could go to a technical standards activity expecting to work on developing a technical standard or a technological standard. But what we have to be aware of is that there will be non-technical aspects that we need to consider, the consumer, the societal aspects. The challenge then becomes, where do you get this expertise? Who are the people who actually have an understanding and appreciation of both sets of issues, the technical issues, the consumer issues, the societal issues? Mostly what we find are people with expertise in either or. And indeed, people can grow to learn these other issues, but is that in a time frame that's compatible with getting a standard out? Also, when people come from these two very different schools of thought, and each side has its own priorities, being able to meld those priorities and come up with a standard without having conflict, without having friction, is getting increasingly hard. So how do you accommodate those? Standards often have to be developed within a certain time frame. What that does is it puts pressure on folks to get let's get the document into the next stage. Let's keep moving it on. One of the things that we're worried about is, will we have to compromise on quality in order to get this document out, because we're still trying to work out the differences of opinion between the technical folks and the non-technical folks. It also raises the question that if indeed things get so difficult that the sides are not able to come together, will groups end up going down alternative paths which may not necessarily be open to everyone to participate? Standardization and participation in standardization has costs associated with it. People have to be able to travel. People have to spend their time on it. When everyone is budget constrained, and certainly the case with the US government, it's certainly the case in US industry, and we're seeing fewer participants, then what happens? If we're not there at the table, we're not a voice at the table, what are the consequences of something like that? And how do we maintain our traditional leadership role? So when we view it from our perspectives as DOC employees, one of the things that becomes very clear is nanotechnology, because of its pervasiveness, is literally touching upon every bureau within the department. We all have different touch points. We all have different interests, but within our mission, it's an area that really is something which we're dealing with. So as different bureaus have different touch points, how do we actually enable information sharing, and how do we start building collaborations across the different bureaus so we can be responsive to our customers' needs? We can engage with our counterparts in different countries, but still kind of be able to really project a broader departmental perspective. And then, because we're all seeing different touch points, how do we actually start understanding early indications of issues which further down the line can become much bigger issues? And then that leads us to the question of, once we have that ability, how do we start framing our responses? So there's some very interesting questions for us to think about in terms of, are there mechanisms where we can increase participation, where we can strengthen our communications between the bureaus, and how do we develop really well-informed DOC positions, or through interagency processes, well-informed US government positions? And then what about the trickle-down or the second-order effects? We may view this purely from a perspective of either technology or standardization. But really, what standardization is just a tool for something bigger. What are those bigger issues? What are the implications on those bigger issues? So just to kind of pull these thoughts together, it's a really exciting area. There's a lot of really neat stuff that's happening. But there's still some very fundamental questions, some very important questions that remain. We have to address those questions. We have to develop the tools, the technical tools. But we also need to have in place the right communication mechanisms. In a sense, nanotechnology and what we're seeing with nanotechnology is a leading indicator. What I mean by that is, I'm certainly of the belief that a lot of what we're seeing here will start to kind of see play out again in other technical areas, and that's because of the convergence of technologies, is because of the very broad impact that technology is having. When you look at it from the standardization world, and what we're seeing over there. One of the things I think we'll actually have to figure out in the standardization space, and this is the brave, I would call this the brave new world of standardization, is I think gone are the days when we had the luxury of going to a standards body and saying, I'll just work on technical standards. I think we had to confront real issues about technical standards, technological standards, particularly in technologies which have a consumer impact, need to start considering those consumer and those societal aspects. How do we find the right balance, the happy balance between the two? And then at the end of the day is how do we keep ourselves informed about these developments and the global impacts that these developments are happening. And that's the end of my slideshow.